Okay, so we're just going to go over key issue 1. We would have done this on Wednesday had we been in school. So this first slide, chapter 2, actually deals with population, and so population with that, the study of humans and human characteristics actually comes from the Greek demos being people, graphy means to write, so to write about people means looking at their characteristics, which could be anything from ethnicity to religion, or distribution patterns, density, migration, things like that. Some key issues that demographers focus on are things like food supply, which in the 60s was a major concern. They were afraid that we were going to outpace our food supply. The Green Revolution that we talk about in the agricultural unit kind of helped ease the gap because it it actually introduced higher yield strands of rice, wheat, and corn and things like that. Health and life expectancy, so looking at life expectancies around the world, infant mortality, child mortality when we're talking about health concerns, the status of women. Of course, efforts to curb population growth has had the greatest impact on women. You've seen an increase in infanticide of females. Female children being malnourished, deprived of care, things like that. And we also look at the effects in terms of women on fertility rate, the amount of babies that they tend to have, and correlations between different things like education and the number of kids, things like that. Migration also included in this. The picture that you saw on that last slide was a picture of a train in Jakarta. Jakarta, Indonesia is one of the most populous cities in the world. It's got about 10 million people. Looking at distribution of the world's people. If you look at the different colors patterns, this represents where 1 billion people are located. So if you notice, of course, North, South America, Australia, it takes all of these countries, New Zealand, to equal 1 billion people. But then look over here in South Asia, where you've got just India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka equals 1 billion. 1 billion people hanging out there. 1 billion people hanging out in just a portion of China, North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. So this should really hit home that most of the world is hanging out in Asia. Okay, very, very important to note some of these things here. You're looking at the top 10 population rank. This is ranked based on the 2017 populations. If you notice the 2000 populations, some things have changed. Like Russia was higher up in 2000, but now with a negative population growth, they're falling down to 9th place. You want to note which areas of the world is increasing at the greatest percentage. So definitely Nigeria is going to be a country that they would possibly ask you about. Notice that if the expectations are met in 2050, you're going to see Nigeria moving on up. I mean, they're going to be in 4th place here. China's going to outpace China. India is going to outpace China if expectations continue. And then things like which 2 countries had the most people in it. I mean, they would expect you to know those things. We're ranked number 3. Indonesia being the most populated island nation in the world. It's the most populated country in Southeast Asia. Most populated country in South America being Brazil. Things like that you do need to note. Okay, this is a cartogram that's showing you once again, distribution. Notice, of course, that people are not evenly distributed across the earth, of course. Humans live actually on a small percentage of the planet. The world contains about 7 times as many people as it did 2 centuries ago. Now, it's worth noting, population density has increased significantly. So where people are clustered. However, population distribution has not. The majority of growth has been in areas that were already settled. So, of course, Asia being one of those main areas. Why? The answer to that is, we want to live in places where we can survive with relative ease and comfort. The higher the altitude, the fewer the inhabitants. The colder the climate, fewer inhabitants, things like that. More arid, we don't want to hang out there. So more arable land is at lower altitudes. So the mid-latitudes is where people tend to be. Between 30 and 30 degrees north and 60 degrees north, and 30 degrees south and 60 degrees south in terms of latitude. Moderate climates are found there, better soils. You're going to find more mid-latitude land in the northern hemisphere. So it goes without saying that most people reside in the northern hemisphere above the equator. Okay. Another thing that would be a good statistic to make sure that you know is that 60% of the world's population can be found in Asia. Here are some other general conclusions in terms of population distribution. Almost 90% north of the equator. Half the world's population lives on just 1% of the land. Another statistic with that is 3/4 of the world lives on 5% of the land. There's 4 cluster regions mentioned in your book. Of course, 3 of those being in Asia, East, South, Southeast Asia, and then Europe. Most people live in areas close to sea level, in mid-latitudes, like I said earlier. We're in about 300 miles of the ocean in terms of population concentrations. Okay, ecumeny. You're going to see this in your book, this exact one. You want to make some notes on it. Literally, ecumeny is just places that supports human permanent settlements. Okay, so where humans have settled permanently, we call that the ecumeny. It's grown over the years. Places originally considered too harsh, we have kind of diminished that over time. We've adapted to it, developed more technology, and so now some of those areas that weren't considered areas that we really want to hang out, originally we've started kind of inhabiting those. But, like I said earlier, we still tend to cluster around the original areas. If you look back to 5000 BC, this is our early river civilizations that were getting started. So you got North Africa, of course, hanging out on the Nile, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, that area. So that might be a good thing to note, where originally we humans settled, and then kind of looking at when we get to the 1st century AD, you've got humans on every continent except Australia and, of course, Antarctica. Okay, so noting that, if you notice outliers, then what might be a question they ask? Well, they might ask you, when did intensive settlement or whatever happen in Australia? Well, that's not going to be around till AD 1900. Okay, so noting things like that are kind of outliers. Like what I mentioned earlier, that Australia was the only one, except for Antarctica, of course, that wasn't inhabited in terms of the ecumeny by AD 1. And then by AD 1900 was when we have the first intensive settlement of Australia. Okay, so things like that. Of course, this goes without saying, but sparsely populated regions tend to be things like too wet, too dry, too cold, too high, things like that. Okay, there's also, when we look at distribution, not only is it physical things like physical geography or whatever that impacts distribution, but also human factors can play into population distribution. Where we decide to place transportation networks impacts distribution. We prefer to be close to trade networks and routes as humans, and so often train lines, roads, rivers, they produce like a linear settlement pattern. Political decisions can also sometimes bring clusters of populations to isolated areas. For example, Canada. Back during the Cold War, to keep an eye on the USSR, they built a military base called Alert, which now is the most northerly community in the entire world. City government, if you look at the city government scale, they can affect population distribution by allowing like high-rise apartments in some areas, reserving other areas for single-family homes, and this also can reflect social stratification. You would expect your less wealthy places and areas of the city to have the high-rise apartments. It can reflect, distribution can reflect cultural or political situations. Forced migration with Trilatiers, force them to settle in other areas. Think about the Mormons in Utah. That was a result of a religious persecution in terms of the human decision to actually settle in an area that would normally not be the first place that humans would settle. Okay, then we get into density. Of course, 3 types of density: arithmetic, physiological, and agricultural. Arithmetic, they still show this a lot, but that is not necessarily what human geographers like to look at because it doesn't give us as much insight. They like physiological, and you need to note things like that. You know, that physiological is going to give us more insight in terms of the population because it provides us with the relationship between the size of the population and the availability of the resource, of the, you know, units of arable land. So that tends to be more important to us than, you know, just overall arithmetic density. Agriculture density also gives us a lot of times ideas in terms of the development of the country, because if they have a higher number of farmers on this arable land, they tend to be less developed because a lot of times they don't have as much of the technology and finances and things that countries like us, and you know, they're more developed. We tend to have fewer farmers because we do have technology, we have finance that allow fewer people to farm extensive land areas and feed many, many people. So it's not as labor intensive in terms of our farming. This just shows you maps, of course. Arithmetic density, of course, you're still going to be able to see the 4 population clusters. They're still going to be very prominent on here. Physiological density, like I said, is going to give us more insight. So we might be a human geographer, people might be more concerned or want to see more about certain countries that have a really high physiological density because we may be a little concerned. Do they have enough resources, enough arable land to support the fact that, you know, 2,000 plus people are clumping onto a square kilometer of land? Agricultural density, once again, it really shows and starts showing us like development. And so you can definitely see sub-Saharan Africa in this particular one, Southeast Asia, also very labor-intensive agriculture that you are seeing in this area. It doesn't mean necessarily that they don't have machines and things. I mean, like China is considered to be, it is still a developing country, but it's not like an LLDC, a lower developed country like you're going to see in some of these areas like Tanzania. And so they might have more machinery and things like that they're employing, but it's still kind of labor intensive in terms of where agriculture is concerned. They need more people farming the land. Oh, let me skip over that really quickly because that's something we'll be doing in class. It's a key to some calculations we'll be doing. Okay, so when we look at those density patterns, you know, we talk about overpopulation and things like that, and they like to give you some questions that can sometimes trip you up if you're not really sure of this. So make sure that you know overpopulation doesn't have as much to do with the numbers as much as the relationship between the number of people and the availability of resources. Okay, and especially the larger issue is sustainability. Can we continue to sustain the number of people on Earth? And that's still a question, and you know, there's lots of debates in terms of that. So when you might see a question, you will see a question, I'm sure, that would be something like, which area would human geographers consider to be possibly overpopulated? And so they might give you some things that would normally throw us off because we're like, wow, that's a lot of people. Like they might say there's 1 million people hanging out on, I don't know, 100 square kilometers of land. And that seems extremely overpopulated to us. But the big question is, can that land support that many people? Because if it is, then they're not overpopulated. Okay, so the bigger question is, or you know, the possible answer would be something like an area that maybe has 1,000 people on 100 square miles of land, but they're concerned with feeding them, that they don't have enough resources, available resources to support those 1,000 people. So they might be overpopulated, even though to us that's not many people, but at the same time, if they don't have enough resources then they are overpopulating, which makes sense. And carrying capacities, sustainability, those are terms that you'll see. You know, carrying capacity is just the number of people, is how much land, or how much the land can carry in terms of supporting on a sustained basis. So it's not a consistent figure like it says there. It depends largely on the level of technology. And, you know, this kind of makes sense because if you've got a region where farmers are making use of modern technology, maybe they're growing some of the Green Revolution crops, they have more irrigation, more machinery, fertilizers, they're going to be able to produce more off of that land than if the farmers in that region were using, you know, outdated tools, not using irrigation, not using fertilizers. They're not going to get as much food off of that land. So a lot of that comes into play there. And so, you know, it's important to consider physiological density when thinking about overpopulation or the circumstances of too many people for the land to support. Industrial societies are able to import raw materials from other areas too, so that plays into it as well. Because, for example, Japan is a prime example of an industrial country with a very high carrying capacity despite its relatively small land space, as well as arable land space, because they can import a lot of stuff. You know, Europe, I mean, it has arable land and stuff, but they're an area that imports a lot of their food and things like that. And so if you're importing a lot of food, or you're using some of these, like we said earlier, the technological improvements, then your carrying capacity may be higher than other areas. Okay, actually this is starting key issue 2, and I'm going to actually stop. We just wanted to go over key issue 1 and make sure you get some notes on that today. So that's about 17 minutes or so, so I'm not going to continue on and bore you. But make sure that you get your notes. Hopefully, I will see you tomorrow in class. Don't forget you have a vocab quiz tomorrow. And also, I'm putting online a video about population, and there's some questions that go with that. So hopefully you guys will have a happy day off today, and this won't take too much of your time. See you tomorrow.